I watched my son raise a glass at the very party paid for with my entire life savings. They told me it was canceled because of money. But the truth, they just wanted me erased from their lives quietly and cruelly, like an emotional assassination. If you think this is just another ordinary family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now to catch more gripping and heartbreaking stories like this one. The morning light filtered through the beige curtains of Eleanor's modest apartment, casting gentle stripes across the hardwood floor. Her alarm clock didn't ring anymore. At 70, her body woke when it wanted, and today it chose silence. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her thin frame as her slippers shuffled against the floorboards, making their soft, familiar whisper. She moved like a habit, a collection of rituals strung together by memory. Her hands, veined and steady despite age, lit the incense in front of a small wooden shrine. At its center stood a framed black-and-white photo of Harold, her late husband smiling in his army uniform. A folded flag rested beside it, carefully preserved under glass. "Morning, Hal," she murmured, her voice hushed with tenderness. 10 years without you. Can you believe it? She reached for the tiny ceramic bowl, replacing the dried flowers with fresh ones. Baby's breath, and a single yellow daisy from the community garden. Then she stood there for a moment, hands clasped, eyes closed. The silence in the apartment was not lonely, just full of absence. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, vibrating once, twice. She turned slowly, already knowing who it would be. Only 2 people ever called her neighbor Marla and Jade. Jade. The name alone summoned a mixture of emotions. Eleanor reached for the phone, her fingers lingering over the green answer icon. "Hello?" "Hi, Eleanor, it's Jade." The voice was all sparkle and polite cheer, the kind that felt like sugar melting over a bitter truth. "I know," Eleanor replied with a warm tone, tucking a stray gray hair behind her ear. "How are you, dear?" "Oh, we're good. Busy. Marcus has just been swamped with work, you know how he gets. Always chasing some deadline." Eleanor smiled faintly, imagining her son hunched over a laptop somewhere, glasses slipping down his nose, muttering to himself while Jade flitted in and out with her high heels clicking on the tile. "That's our Marcus," she said softly. There was a pause, an unnatural one. Jade's voice returned, slightly lowered, rehearsed. "Listen, Eleanor, I wanted to talk to you about the anniversary party." Eleanor's heart lifted just hearing it. She had been counting the days, had already picked out a cream dress, and was halfway done knitting a small decorative wall hanging that said, 10 years forever to go. She'd planned to write a speech too, something short but sincere about love surviving through hardship. "Yes," she said, already picturing the big night, the candles, the toast. We have to cancel." The air seemed to shift. Eleanor stood straighter. "Cancel," she repeated. "Yes, just for now," Jade continued. "It's the finances, you know. The economy's been rough, and with Marcus's hours being all over the place, we just decided to keep it low-key this year. Maybe next year we'll throw something bigger, just us and a bottle of wine this time around." Eleanor held the phone tightly, her thumb pressed against the cool screen. Her lips parted slightly, then closed again. She forced herself to smile, even though no one could see it. "I understand," she said gently. Jade launched into a light laugh. "I knew you'd be the understanding one. You're always so gracious about these things." Eleanor nodded, even though the call had already moved on. Jade said something about a nail appointment and having to dash. Then she was gone, and the phone screen faded to black. For a moment, Eleanor stood motionless in the middle of her small kitchen, her fingers curled around the edge of the counter. The silence crept in again, but this time it carried a chill. The faint scent of incense still lingered behind her. She turned and walked toward the small table where a box sat wrapped in gold tissue and tied with a ribbon. Inside was the gift she'd spent weeks crafting, a handmade embroidery piece framed in oak featuring 2 birds in flight and the words, "Still choosing each other." She traced the edge of the box with her fingertip. Her chest ached with a familiar disappointment. It wasn't just the cancellation. It was the way Jade had said it, like it was an afterthought, something inconvenient she had to check off her list. Eleanor took a breath, deep and even, and reached for the card she hadn't yet signed. She picked up her pen and wrote in her careful script, May your love keep growing even in quiet years. She closed the lid, tied the ribbon tighter, and set the gift back on the table. That's when the second call came. Her phone lit up again, but this time it wasn't a familiar name. The caller ID simply read Wine and Coast Delivery. Eleanor hesitated but answered. Hello. Hi there, this is Louise from Wine and Coast Deliveries. Just confirming your order for the Marcus Holloway party at Ocean Ridge Villa. 6 cases of Chardonnay, 2 of Merlot, and 1 specialty champagne. Eleanor blinked. I'm sorry, what party? Marcus Holloway Ocean Ridge delivery for Saturday. We've got a 4 p.m. drop-off time. She gripped the phone tighter. This is Eleanor Holloway. Marcus is my son. A pause on the other end. Oh, I apologize, ma'am. I thought this was the contact number for the billing address. No, Eleanor said, voice quieter now. I'm sure it's just a mix-up. Should I still confirm the order? She swallowed, pulse rising. Yes, go ahead. Got it. Thank you and have a great day. The line went dead. Eleanor stood in place, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator behind her. A slight wind moved the curtain in the living room, and then silence. Ocean Ridge Villa. A party. 6 cases of wine. Specialty champagne. Not cancelled, not modest, not private. Her hands began to tremble slightly as she placed the phone down. She stared at it like it had betrayed her. And maybe it had. Or maybe it had finally told her the truth. Her eyes drifted to the gold-wrapped gift again, still choosing each other. How ironic. She walked over to the window, pulled back the curtain, and stared down at the quiet street. A couple jogged by, laughing about something, their voices muffled by distance. A delivery van turned the corner. Life was still happening indifferently while something inside her had begun to fracture. But Eleanor didn't cry, not yet. She returned to the table, untied the ribbon from the box, and lifted the lid. She stared at the embroidery, at the careful stitches she'd made in the evenings by the soft light of her reading lamp. Each thread was a small act of hope, of love, of belief. She reached inside and pulled it out, holding it in both hands. Her face remained still, expression unreadable. Then slowly, deliberately, she folded the cloth into quarters and placed it back inside the box. She didn't rewrap it. She left it open, exposed, let it breathe, because something inside her had changed in that moment, quietly, without fury, without drama, but irrevocably. Eleanor turned to the clock. 7:01 a.m. The sun had barely begun its climb across the sky, but for Eleanor a new day had already begun. Eleanor stood in front of the glass doors of Westbridge Community Bank, her fingers laced tightly around the strap of her handbag. She hadn't set foot in here in months. The air inside smelled of air conditioning, freshly printed receipts, and something synthetic like too much polish trying to cover years of worry. The young woman behind the counter smiled automatically. Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you today? Eleanor stepped forward, her voice calm but with a slight edge of something taut beneath it. I'd like to review my most recent savings account transactions, she said. Sure, just a moment. May I have your ID, please? Eleanor passed it over, watching the screen flicker with data as the teller clicked through her account. The young woman's brows knit together briefly, just enough for Eleanor to notice. She tapped a few more keys and printed something. Here's a detailed list of the last 30 days' activity, she said, sliding the printout across the desk. Is there anything specific you'd like me to explain? Eleanor didn't answer right away. She picked up the paper, adjusted her glasses, and stared at the neatly typed lines. There it was, $12,500. Withdrawn in 2 separate transactions, $7,000 just 9 days ago. Another $500 3 days later. Both labeled online transfer, verified recipient. Her stomach tightened. She knew that number. It wasn't random. It was the exact amount left in the account after her fixed monthly expenses money she'd quietly saved over time, planning maybe to renovate the apartment, take a cruise, or simply have a cushion for her old age. Gone, clean, silent. Her lips barely moved. No, that's all, thank you. She folded the receipt and slipped it into her purse like it was a letter bomb. Outside, the sun glared down like it knew something. Eleanor stood on the sidewalk, blinking into the light. Traffic passed in indifferent waves. Her breath came slower now, deeper. The world hadn't collapsed. Not yet. But something inside her had shifted again. Jade's voice echoed in her head. We had to cancel. It's the finances, you know. No, it wasn't. She walked back to her car with new purpose, her mind burning through possibilities. The Ocean Ridge Villa was almost 2 hours away along the coast. She hadn't been there in years, not since Marcus had first bought the place. He'd called it an investment property, but Eleanor knew Jade had picked it. A vacation home with marble floors and ocean views perched right where the wealthy posed their lives for Instagram. Eleanor drove in silence, both hands on the wheel, her jaw clenched. As the freeway slipped into winding roads flanked by wild seagrass and windswept trees, a slow heaviness settled over her chest. She kept thinking maybe, just maybe, it was all a misunderstanding. Maybe the delivery driver had the wrong house. Maybe the withdrawal was some automated bill payment. Maybe. Jade would open the door, laugh her bright little laugh, and say, "Eleanor, you're just in time." But hope, Eleanor had learned, was often the last refuge of the deceived. By the time she reached the overlook near the beach, the sun was dipping lower, casting long gold fingers across the waves. From where she parked, hidden under the shade of a jacaranda tree, she could see the entire property from a slight elevation. And there it was. Not just the house, the event. Catering vans lined the driveway. Strings of lights had already been draped across the patio, casting soft glows across the manicured hedges. Tables draped in white linen sparkled with crystal and polished cutlery. Waiters in black and white uniforms buzzed around like worker bees setting up the hive. And then the guests began to arrive. Women in flowing dresses stepped out of sleek sedans. Men in pastel shirts and sharp blazers laughed and clasped hands. There were clinks of glasses, the sound of soft jazz drifting through high-end speakers. Eleanor didn't move. She sat behind the wheel, her fingers digging into the vinyl steering wheel, watching. There were candles in glass orbs. There were roses, hundreds of them, nestled in centerpieces that matched the golden hues of the sunset. A 6-tiered cake gleamed under a small archway covered in vines. And then she saw him. Marcus, her son, her boy, laughing. He stood near the head of the long banquet table, dressed in a navy blazer and pale shirt. No tie, just casual enough to fit the relaxed affluence of the crowd, just formal enough to look like the man of the hour. And beside him, clinging to his arm like a perfectly manicured vine, was Jade. Her dress shimmered like champagne, her makeup flawless, her expression victorious. She kissed Marcus on the cheek as someone clinked a glass for a toast. The crowd turned toward them. Eleanor cracked the car window slightly. The distant murmur of voices floated in just enough to catch fragments. 10 incredible years. Our favorite couple. To love, to loyalty. The group cheered. Champagne was poured, glasses raised. Eleanor's eyes burned, not just from the salt air. She saw Marcus smiling as he gestured toward the guests, hand in Jade's. She saw Jade throw her head back in laughter as someone handed her a wrapped gift. And all of it, every light, every flower, every drop of celebration was paid for, with Eleanor's silence, with the money scraped from her quiet, unseen sacrifices. And they hadn't even invited her. She was nothing more than a footnote, a detail to be omitted in the pursuit of elegance. Eleanor turned off the ignition, but didn't get out. She stepped out of her car, only in her mind, marching up to the gate, throwing the receipt in Jade's face, shouting the truth for everyone to hear. But she didn't. Instead, she sat still, watching. The sea roared in the distance, indifferent. Behind her, the first stars were blinking to life. And then she saw something that shattered her. Marcus raised his glass, speaking to the crowd. She couldn't hear the words, but his smile said it all. Jade leaned her head against his shoulder. He kissed her temple. They looked happy, genuinely happy. And she wasn't even a ghost in that scene. Just gone, just edited out. Eleanor reached for her purse, pulling out the printed statement from the bank. She held it next to the image before her. The laughter, the abundance, the glow. Cause and effect. Her hands trembled as she folded the paper back, tucking it beside her chest like armor. Then quietly Eleanor opened the door, stepped out, and walked across the grassy bluff to a weathered wooden bench overlooking the beach. She sat down slowly, the joints in her knees stiff from age and heartbreak. The wind curled around her gray hair, but she didn't smooth it, she let it fly. Below, the party was in full bloom. Music played louder now. Someone had uncorked the champagne. People danced. Someone shouted a toast, and there, sitting all alone under the growing night, Eleanor began to cry, not in the way of operas or movies. No heaving sobs, no wails to the sky. Her tears came quietly, relentlessly, each drop carving its own path down her weathered cheeks. She wept for the son who didn't see her, for the years she gave up raising him alone after Harold died, for the holidays she spent trying to prove her worth in a house where she was merely tolerated, for every moment she chose silence instead of conflict, for every time she said, "It's okay," when it wasn't. She cried because love like hers didn't make headlines or anniversary speeches. It made bank withdrawals. She sat there until the music blurred into the sound of waves, until the cold began to seep into her hands, until the last of the guests disappeared back into luxury cars, until the lights on the patio dimmed and the roses no longer glowed. And when there was nothing left to see, Eleanor wiped her face, stood up, and walked back to her car. She didn't look at the house again, didn't look back. She turned the key in the ignition and drove off into the night. But something stayed behind on that bench by the sea. The old Eleanor, the quiet one, the one who waited for invitations. She would never return. The door to Eleanor's apartment clicked shut behind her with the softest thud, but the silence that followed felt cavernous. She didn't turn on the light right away. Instead, she leaned against the door for a moment, allowing the darkness to fold around her like a blanket, not one of comfort, but of resignation. Her shoes slipped off with the softest creak of old leather. She stepped into the dimness barefoot, each step slow as if the floor itself could give way beneath her. The air inside still held the faint scent of morning incense. Familiar, intimate, betrayed. The living room was exactly as she left it. The throw pillow slightly crooked on the armchair. The ceramic teacup still on the tray. A blanket folded on the edge of the couch for no one but herself. But the shrine was different now. She walked to it, knelt slowly. Her knees popped and the bones in her shoulders groaned in protest. She didn't care. Harold's photo smiled down at her from its perch, forever young in his uniform, his face full of quiet pride. She stared at him for a long time. Her hand reached up, fingertips brushing the edge of the frame. Her lips parted. "They threw the party, Hal," she whispered. "They used our money, and they didn't even tell me." A tear fell, tracing the corner of her nose before catching at the crease of her mouth. Another followed, then another. But they came silently, as if even her sadness had grown tired of making sound. "They drank champagne with my name on the check," she said bitterly, now each word tighter. "And they toasted to loyalty while I watched from a bench across the sea." She pressed her palm flat against the shrine's surface. "Tell me you saw it. Please tell me you saw it too." She didn't expect an answer, but something inside her cracked all the same. That night she didn't sleep. Instead, Eleanor pulled out the old ledger she kept in the kitchen drawer. Not a digital app, not a spreadsheet, just a sturdy blue notebook, the kind with thick pages and a little cloth ribbon to mark your place. She'd always preferred writing things down, feeling the pen scratch against the paper like truth setting itself in ink. She flipped to the last page she'd written 3 months ago. A grocery bill, a pharmacy charge, a quiet donation to the library. She reached for the printed bank statement she'd gotten earlier that day and began comparing. And the inconsistencies began. $83.74, April 14th, Newman's Kids Apparel. She frowned. She hadn't bought Tommy anything in months, not since Christmas. $129, April 18th, Natural Glow Spa Center, a spa. She hadn't had a professional massage since her 50th birthday, 64:30. April 21st, Florette Bistro. She ate alone, at home, always. On and on it went, little drops of water chipping away at the stone of her trust. Each number, each vendor name, each date was like a pinprick to her chest, small, precise, but relentless. At first she thought maybe she'd forgotten. Maybe she'd ordered something and just didn't recall. But the amounts were too specific, too consistent, and too unfamiliar. She pushed herself up from the kitchen table and walked into her bedroom, opening the file cabinet under her bed. She pulled out envelopes, bills, receipts, tax records, all the documents of a life spent being responsible. She brought them back to the table and began cross-referencing. Her pen trembled in her hand as she circled charges. She reached for a legal pad and started a fresh list. One column for the date, one for the amount, one for the business, and finally a fourth reason. Most were left blank. By the time the grandfather clock in the corner struck 1 a.m., she'd filled 4 pages. She paused only to sip cold water. Her eyes were dry from strain, but her hands kept moving. The writing was slower now, the letters jagged but still legible. 219.50s. Laverne Fine Dining. March 12th. Dinner reservation, $97,000. Eden Floral Boutique. March 18th. Roses. 410 Hund. Bayside. Photo booth. Rentals. April 2nd. Event equipment. That last one made her sit back. Her breath caught. Photo booth rentals. She reached for the receipt from the delivery driver's call. Wine. Champagne. The pieces clicked. This wasn't just a pattern of indulgence. It was a build-up to the very party they said didn't exist. Each transaction a petal on the blooming lie. They had been planning it for weeks, maybe longer, all while she'd been crocheting their gift. Eleanor pressed her palm to her forehead, eyes closing for a moment as a shudder passed through her. And then the memory came. Jade's first visit to their home. The front door opened, and Marcus, young and full of nervous pride, stood with a tall girl in a pink coat and wide sunglasses. "Mom," he said, beaming, "this is Jade." The girl stepped forward, smiling sweetly. She handed Eleanor a bottle of wine, expensive imported. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Mrs. Halloway." Eleanor remembered smiling back stiffly but politely. Jade's handshake had been soft, but her gaze direct, studying, calculating. Even then, later that night, Harold had nudged Eleanor while brushing his teeth. "She's got ambition," he'd said, mouthful of foam. "Hope Marcus can keep up." Eleanor had chuckled. "She called me ma'am like I was 90. "She's respectful," Harold said. "That's rare these days." But it hadn't felt like respect. Not really. It felt like strategy. In the months that followed, Jade began to shape things, little suggestions that became routines. She'd accidentally show up for dinner and insist on cooking. She'd critique Eleanor's decor choices with passive compliments. She helped Marcus create a more modern savings plan and streamline family communications. Eleanor thought she was being old-fashioned, resistant to change, so she'd stepped back. She always stepped back. And now here she was, decades later, trying to decode the same woman's trail of polished deception. Eleanor's eyes flicked to the phone on the counter. A message had come in an hour ago, from Jade. "Hope you're doing okay. Let's get coffee next week, XOXO. Eleanor stared at the message, her thumb hovering over it. But she didn't open it. She didn't reply. Instead, she reached for another envelope, this one with the logo of the financial advisor Marcus had connected her with 5 years ago. A courtesy referral, he'd called it. Eleanor had never met the man. All her finances had been handled online, since then consolidated, automated, efficient. She dug through the fine print looking for access details for the name on the shared account. And there it was. Joint authorized user J. Halloway. Not Marcus, not even him, just Jade. She leaned back in her chair, the weight of this realization settling on her chest like a stone slab. She had given Jade access. Years ago, when they were going through their first house purchase, when they needed help with the down payment. Eleanor had wanted to be supportive, to help her son start his life, and Jade had taken that kindness, wrapped it in smiles, and weaponized it. The clock ticked forward. The refrigerator hummed. Eleanor flipped through the legal pad, her notes now 6 pages long. The timeline was clear, the pattern consistent, and the story undeniable. This wasn't a single betrayal. It was an embezzlement of love, of dignity, of trust. She reached for the pen again and wrote at the top of a new page, all caps, "She's been doing this for years." Then below it, "And I let her." The words sat there like wounds. And yet, in the silence that followed, something new stirred within Eleanor. Not grief, not shame. Focus. A coiling energy, slow but deliberate. She pulled out her address book, flipped to the section labeled Contacts, Financial, Legal. Most numbers were outdated. But one name caught her eye, Ruth Teller, a retired lawyer she'd volunteered with years ago. She circled the name, scribbled a note beside it. Then she stood. Eleanor moved to the living room, turned on the lamp, and sat down beside the framed photo of Marcus as a toddler. His hair wild and golden, a big toothless grin across his face. He was holding a plastic dinosaur in one hand, the other wrapped around Eleanor's neck. "I raised you better than this," she whispered. "You knew what integrity looked like." She reached out, touched the glass. Then one by one she gathered her documents. She stacked her notes. She labeled envelopes. By the time dawn bled pale across the window, Eleanor had filled a folder with everything she needed. Her hands were tired, but they were steady. The morning after Eleanor finished compiling every receipt, every unexplained transaction, and every quiet betrayal that had unfolded under her roof, she got dressed with deliberate care. A charcoal gray skirt pressed flat, a clean blouse with a navy scarf tucked neatly under the collar. Her makeup minimal but present. The woman staring back at her in the mirror wasn't broken. She wasn't even angry now. She looked composed. And composition, she knew, was a powerful form of resistance. She walked into the offices of Hendricks and Rowe just past 10 a.m. The smell of expensive paper and old wood surrounded her as she stepped into the waiting room. The receptionist looked up startled, as if she didn't expect someone like Eleanor to move with such quiet force. "Mrs. Halloway, I have an appointment with Richard Teller," she said. "I believe he's expecting me." Ruth Teller's younger brother Richard was still practicing, sharp, precise, and discreet, exactly what Eleanor needed. Inside the office, Richard stood from his leather chair and extended his hand. "Mrs. Halloway, a pleasure to see you again." "I wish I were here under better circumstances," she replied. They sat. Richard offered her coffee. She declined. Then, without preamble, she opened her file folder and slid it across the desk. "I want to sell my apartment," she said. "Immediately. I also need access to the remaining brokerage accounts tied to Harold's estate. I'll be liquidating them." Richard lifted his brows, glancing over the first few pages. "This is considerable." "It was meant to support me until I die," Eleanor said plainly. "Plans change." He hesitated. "May I ask where you intend to go?" "I don't intend to die here," she said. "That's all you need to know." There was silence. Then Richard nodded slowly. "I'll draw up the paperwork. You'll need to sign over power of sale." "I'm prepared," she said, and pulled another envelope from her purse. As he scanned the documents, Eleanor sat still in the chair, hands clasped, legs crossed at the ankle. Outside the office window, the city pulsed with its usual indifferent rhythm horns, footsteps, the rise and fall of voices. But inside, the air felt sharp with finality. This wasn't an escape. It was an exodus. By mid-afternoon, Eleanor was standing in the dusty little photo shop off Main Street, the one with faded Kodak signs and a bell that jingled when you opened the door. She hadn't been there in years, but the old man behind the counter recognized her immediately. "Mrs. Halloway," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Well, this is a surprise." "I'm here for some prints," she said. "From these." She handed him a USB stick labeled in her own handwriting, "Moments That Mattered." He slid it into the machine behind the counter, eyes narrowing as he clicked through the files. "Marcus," he asked, pausing at a photo of a tow-headed boy climbing a tree. "Yes." "He had your eyes," the man said. "Still does." Eleanor's voice was low. "I'm not so sure anymore." She selected 20 images, her and Marcus at the zoo, blowing bubbles in the backyard, baking cookies in a flour-dusted kitchen. One of Harold holding their newborn son in a hospital blanket. Another of the three of them at Christmas, their arms tangled in laughter and ribbons. And one more, just Eleanor taken by a stranger during her solo trip to Florence years ago. She was sitting on a stone bench, smiling toward the sun face, half in shadow. "I want this one enlarged," she said. "Black and white, frame ready." "Beautiful shot," the man said. "It's the last one I remember feeling like myself," she replied. By the time she walked out with the envelope of fresh prints, the sky had turned the color of steel. Eleanor stood under the awning and let the wind push gently at her coat. The photographs were warm against her chest. They were proof that she had existed long before Jade, that her motherhood had once been innocent, that her love had been real even if it had been misplaced. From the photo shop, she went straight to a community wellness center on the edge of town. A faded banner above the entrance read, "Breathe, release, begin again." Eleanor approached the woman at the registration desk. She was young, with dreadlocks tied in a bun, and a peaceful gaze that reminded Eleanor of spring water. "I'm here for the mindfulness program," she said. "The short one. I don't have time for the long one." The woman smiled, not patronizing but gently, and handed her a clipboard. "Even a few days can make a difference." Eleanor signed up for a 3-day silent meditation retreat starting the following Monday. Nothing fancy, just time away from the noise, from screens, from Jade's voice in her head, from her own doubts. As she handed back the clipboard, she hesitated. "I'm also looking for travel resources," she said. "Something international, rural, not touristy." The woman's eyes lit up. "Peru," she said immediately. "There's a place near the Sacred Valley, quiet, breathtaking. A lot of healing work happens there." Eleanor smiled for the first time in days. "Tell me more." They sat in a quiet corner. The woman pulled out brochures, maps, testimonials. Pictures of stone terraces high in the Andes, of sunrises that split the sky like a secret being whispered. "There's a program that teaches traditional tea blending. Very grounding," she said. Eleanor held a photo in her hands, a tea house tucked into a cliffside, its windows glowing warm against the dusk. She didn't need to think long. "This is where I'm going," she said. That night back home, Eleanor sat at her desk beneath the yellow light of a small lamp. Before her was a sheet of ivory paper and a fountain pen Harold had once gifted her. She began writing, not an email, not a text, but a letter. "Dear Marcus, by the time you read this, I'll be somewhere else. Somewhere quiet, somewhere honest. I've spent my life loving you with a kind of ferocity that only mothers understand. I have watched you become a man, a husband, a father. And I have tried so very hard to believe that you would see me through the same lens of care and respect I saw you with. But I was wrong. I gave without expecting much. But I never expected to be erased. That is a different kind of betrayal, Marcus, not loud, not violent, but slow. Surgical, the kind that slices without blood. You stood beside someone who chipped away at my existence with a smile, and you called it love. So I'm leaving not out of bitterness, but clarity, because this chapter ends here, not with a confrontation, not with drama, just silence, the kind that says everything. Please tell Tommy I love him. I hope someday he finds the kind of strength I had to rediscover for myself. This will be the last letter I write from this life. With love, Mom." Eleanor signed her name with deliberate grace. Then she slipped the letter into an envelope and sealed it. She didn't address it, not yet. Instead, she opened the drawer of her desk and pulled out a worn leather journal. She hadn't written in it for years, but tonight she did. At the top of a blank page she wrote, "The last journey won't be shared with liars." Then underneath, "This time I'll go where my soul isn't filtered through someone else's convenience. This time I'll sip tea beside strangers and tell stories without looking over my shoulder. This time I'll belong to no one and everything." She closed the book. The apartment was quiet, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was brimming with resolve, with defiance, with the low thrum of a woman who had spent a lifetime giving others the first word, and had finally chosen to write her own ending. The cafe sat on the corner of a tree-lined street, small and inconspicuous, with chipped yellow paint on the doorframe and a chalkboard sign outside that read, "Today's special ginger lemon tea plus secrets optional." Eleanor had chosen the place carefully. It was far enough from the neighborhoods of curated brunches and Pinterest-perfect parenting circles that Jade and her crew frequented. Here no one expected eye cream or small talk, just caffeine and quiet corners. She arrived 15 minutes early, slid into a booth near the back and ordered a mint tea she wouldn't drink. Her scarf was pulled tight around her neck despite the warmth, and she wore sunglasses indoors, not to hide, but to observe without being observed. 5 minutes later, the bell above the cafe door jingled. In walked Alina, Jade's longtime friend. The one who posted passive-aggressive quotes about boundaries and protecting your energy, but still somehow knew everyone's business. Eleanor had always suspected she was Jade's mirror, not quite a best friend, not quite a rival, but orbiting each other in the same social galaxy of curated smiles and knife-edged whispers. "Mrs. Halloway," Alina approached with curiosity. Eleanor removed her sunglasses slowly. "Call me Eleanor, dear. Sit. I won't take much of your time." Alina hesitated, then slid in across the table. "Jade didn't mention you wanted to meet. She doesn't know." Eleanor smiled politely. "I thought I'd surprise you." Alina blinked. "Is this about the party?" "Oh no," Eleanor said lightly. "That's already behind me." Alina relaxed slightly, shoulders dropping. Good. Because that whole situation got so messy. You know Jade felt awful. Eleanor held up a hand. I'm not here for apologies, just some clarity. Alina paused. Clarity? You're close with Jade, closer than anyone, I think. You've known her through everything, haven't you? The house, the baby, the financial transitions. Something flickered behind Alina's eyes. Well, we're friends, sure, but we don't talk about money things. Don't we? Eleanor said, voice low, smile unwavering. Strange, because I was just wondering who helped Jade set up the foreign account under her name. The one that's been receiving monthly wire transfers. Alina's breath caught. Eleanor leaned in. Listen, dear, I don't care about your loyalty. I just want facts. No drama, no judgment. Just who's helping her move money out of the country? I don't know what you mean, Alina, Eleanor said, dropping her smile. I'm 70 years old. I've lived through 2 recessions, buried a husband, and wiped more blood from scraped knees than you've seen in your life. Don't insult me with I don't know. You're too clever for that. Alina's mouth opened, then closed. A long silence. Then it's a friend of mine, in accounting. She asked me to help her open a Payoneer wallet. I didn't know what it was for, I swear. Eleanor tilted her head. And you didn't think to ask? I thought it was for freelance gigs, branding contracts or something. You know Jade's always taking on side projects. Eleanor nodded slowly. That's all I needed to know. I didn't mean Alina began, but Eleanor was already sliding out of the booth. Don't worry, dear, she said, pulling her scarf tighter. We all make mistakes. Alina stared down into her untouched cappuccino, suddenly small in a room too loud. Back home, Eleanor wasted no time. She booted up the old laptop she used only for bills and emails, opened a private browser, and created a fresh Gmail account under the name CivicWatcher49. She typed with precision, crafting the tone to be firm, factual, and impossible to ignore. Subject urgent. Unauthorized account activity linked to joint cardholder. Dear Fraud and Risk Investigation Department. This is an anonymous tip regarding suspicious financial activity tied to credit card account ending in 7281 associated with account holder Marcus Halloway and joint user Jay Halloway. It is believed that the secondary cardholder has been initiating large recurring wire transfers to foreign accounts under false pretense without the knowledge or consent of the primary cardholder. Please verify account activity from the past 18 months and flag any international transactions linked to digital wallets or merchant gateways with overseas IPs. Attached is a list of merchant names and associated amounts for review. Sincerely, a concerned third party. She attached a file, her ledger of dates, vendors, and annotations, and hit send. Then she leaned back and waited. Less than 48 hours later, Marcus received a call from the bank. He was standing in the driveway trying to wrestle Tommy's science project into the back seat of the car when his phone rang. Mr. Halloway, the man on the other end, said, "This is Darren with Summit Financial's risk management team. We've noticed some irregularities on your account." Marcus frowned. Irregularities. There have been consistent wire transfers to unverified external entities. Some offshore, some linked to cryptocurrency processors, all authorized through your joint cardholder access. Marcus's heart stuttered. My wife handles most of our finances, he said cautiously. But if something's wrong, I need to know. We've sent a transaction history to your email. We recommend reviewing it immediately. If these charges are unauthorized, we'll need confirmation in writing. The call ended. Marcus stood there, phone in one hand, Tommy's glitter-covered volcano in the other, feeling as though someone had tipped his entire life sideways. That evening he sat at the kitchen island laptop open, scrolling through the bank's attached report. His brow tightened. $2,300. Nova Markets. Dubai. One now. $125. Finex Digital Estonia, $4, $050. Greenstone, Freelance Wallet, Vietnam, dozens of them. Some marked as consulting, some as project fees, all obscure, all foreign, and none of them familiar. His breath came fast and shallow. His fingers clenched the mouse like a weapon. Behind him, Jade walked in carrying a tray with tea and a gentle hum on her lips. "Hey, babe, you look intense." Marcus turned slowly. "You've been sending money overseas." Jade froze. The teacup clinked against the tray. "What are you talking about?" The bank called, showed me the transfers. She blinked, laughed too quickly. Marcus, it's nothing. Just side income shuffling for my design work. Remember I told you about that branding gig for the European skincare brand? No, he said, voice flat. You didn't. She set the tray down with more force. God, Marcus, why are you always assuming the worst? Did your mother put you up to this? That stopped him. What? You know how she is. Always meddling, making you second-guess every decision. She's never accepted me, Marcus, never. This has nothing to do with her. It always does, Jade snapped. She's been poisoning you against me for years. He stood up. I'm not being poisoned, I'm being robbed. Jade's face twisted into a mask he hadn't seen before, not sadness, not confusion, but calculation. The kind Eleanor had warned him about long ago in softer tones he'd dismissed as old-fashioned suspicion. Jade reached for his arm. Listen to me, I can explain. No, he said, voice cold, you can defend. She blinked at the shift in him. Marcus, for the first time in years, looked like a man unchained from guilt. He stepped back, picked up his phone, and walked toward the door. Where are you going? She asked, voice rising. To get fresh air, he said, slipping on his jacket. And to think. He didn't slam the door. He closed it gently. And outside, under the sharp wind of early autumn, Marcus stood still, breathing hard, staring up at the night sky, as if it might hand him an answer. Above him, the stars blinked indifferently. But for the first time, he didn't feel blind. Something inside had cracked open, something long buried under years of quiet submission of permission disguised as peace. Now finally it stirred, and Jade had reason to be afraid. The phone rang at 6:14 p.m. sharp, persistent, demanding. Eleanor was sitting in her dimly lit kitchen, finishing the final line of her travel itinerary. A passport envelope opened beside her when the screen lit up with her son's name. Marcus. She stared at it, her thumb hovering. Then she answered. Hello, Marcus. His voice hit like a storm without warning, tight, furious. What did you do? She blinked once, slowly. I'm not sure what you mean. Don't do that, he snapped. Don't pretend this wasn't you. I got a call from the bank. I got a call from Jade's friend. I got an email flagged by IT at my office, anonymous, but clearly full of my mother's handwriting. You've been prying into our accounts, into our lives. Eleanor stood slowly, one hand resting against the counter. I wasn't prying, I was protecting what was left. You don't get to decide that, Marcus said. This is my marriage, my family. You've overstepped. A silence fell between them, as sharp and brittle as broken glass. Eleanor closed her eyes, her voice came low. Con sẽ hiểu khi quá muộn. Marcus was quiet. Then he said, cold and clipped. You've been trying to sabotage Jade since the beginning. Admit it. She didn't answer. Just stay out of it, he added, voice cracking slightly now. For once, stay out of it. And then the line went dead. Eleanor lowered the phone, placed it gently on the table, and stood in the quiet ticking of the clock. Her hand trembled once, then steadied. She didn't cry. Instead, she opened the drawer, took out a small box wrapped in cream paper, and unfolded the note inside. The ticket glinted under the light, a one-way flight to Cusco. She set it on the table next to the letter she'd been revising. Then came the ping, a message from Jade. It was short, cruel in the way that only cowards with keyboards can be. You always played the victim, Eleanor. But the truth is you're just old and bitter and in everyone's way. You should have known when to fade out. Guess that's hard when you're clinging to what little power you have left. No one needs your guilt, your judgments, or your sad attempts at control. Women like you don't matter anymore. Eleanor stared at the words and smiled, not bitterly, not even sadly, but with something colder, older, wiser. She stood, walked over to the desk, and opened the small wooden box where she kept documents. She never thought she'd need again her marriage license, Harold's death certificate, Tommy's birth card. She slipped the message inside. Then she reached for the envelope she'd prepared days ago, addressed in cursive, sealed with care. Inside the flight ticket and the balance statement of her now empty savings account. She wrote a single sentence on the note tucked in between. This is your inheritance, Marcus. Whatever you do next, earn it. The envelope went out that night, mailed from a small 24-hour postal counter on the edge of town, where no one knew her name. She wore a black coat, no makeup. She walked like a shadow. No return address, no forwarding instructions, just finality. 2 hours later, she stood at the window of her apartment, staring out at the orange haze of the city she'd called home for 5 decades. The apartment was stripped now, her photo albums gone, her books boxed and mailed to a friend in Portland, her pantry emptied, key turned in. Her phone sat on the windowsill screen dark. She didn't bring it with her when she left. Just her passport, one suitcase, and a heart no longer bent around expectations. She took the elevator down one last time, nodded at the concierge who barely looked up, walked through the revolving door that creaked faintly on its hinge. And just like that, Eleanor was gone. The woman who had spent 70 years being careful, kind, convenient, she vanished into the night like mist dissolving off the ocean. There were no grand goodbyes, no dramatic letters, no pleas. She didn't tell Marcus she forgave him, because forgiveness wasn't owed. It had to be earned. She didn't tell Jade she pitied her, because pity, like poison, is only lethal when swallowed. She just walked into the quiet, into the unknown, with a spine that had stopped bending. The bus station was nearly empty at that hour. A man in a janitor's uniform mopped the floor while the night shift clerk clicked lazily through her computer screen. Eleanor bought a ticket to a small regional airport 2 hours south, less traceable, less crowded. When the woman behind the counter asked, "Return trip?" Eleanor said softly, "No." She boarded the 2:10 a.m. coach and took the window seat near the back. Outside, the city moved past her like a silent confession, neon signs, closed bookstores, alley cats, crossing beneath flickering lamps. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The city had already let her go. Hours passed in silence. Eleanor kept one hand on the handle of her suitcase, the other wrapped around the strap of her bag. She was no longer thinking about Marcus. She was thinking about Peru, about tea brewed in high altitudes, about children who would greet her not as a burden, but a curiosity, about strangers who didn't know what she had endured, only what she offered. She was thinking about waking up without her name being a weapon, or her silence being mistaken for surrender. She dozed briefly as dawn began to break the horizon, leaking light across the clouds like someone had cracked the sky. She arrived at the airport just as the sun kissed the tarmac. No fanfare. Just a woman in a coat stepping off a bus with nothing left to lose. She checked in without hesitation, handed over her documents, and walked toward the gate with her head high. She carried no grief, only closure. And somewhere hours later, as the plane lifted into the morning sky, Marcus was opening the envelope. His fingers shook as he unfolded the contents. One one-way ticket, one balance statement showing $0, and a sentence. "This is your inheritance. Whatever you do next, earn it." He sat down slowly, the breath knocked from his lungs. He tried calling her, but the number was disconnected. He tried messaging her, but the account was gone. He sat in his home, the walls suddenly smaller, the rooms colder, the silence unbearable. Jade stood across the kitchen, arms crossed, eyes hard. And for the first time in their marriage, Marcus realized he had been left behind, not just by a mother, but by the last person who had ever truly protected him from himself. He didn't say a word to Jade. He just folded the letter again, slipped it into his pocket, and looked out the window where nothing had changed. But everything had shifted. When Eleanor stepped off the bus in the heart of the Sacred Valley, it felt like the world had exhaled. Not the kind of exhale that comes after exhaustion, but the release that follows a long, tightly held breath, one so silent and slow you hadn't even realized your lungs were aching. The air was thinner here, lighter. The sky hung low and endless above the jagged green mountains, clouds draped across their peaks like silk scarves thrown over ancient shoulders. The sun wasn't harsh. It was golden kind, warming the stones beneath her worn shoes, as if welcoming her by touch. She didn't speak much as she crossed the cobbled road toward the edge of the village, her suitcase rolling behind her like a quiet child. There was no hotel reservation. Just an address handwritten on a scrap of paper by Patricia, the kind woman at the travel agency, who'd pressed her hand and said, "It's not just a house, it's a healing place." The house sat on a ledge overlooking a valley of wildflowers and terraced fields. Its whitewashed walls were stained with time, and its blue shutters cracked with age. But it stood strong like a woman who had weathered many storms and didn't flinch when the next one came. Eleanor stood at the gate and breathed in deeply. This would do. This would be home. The landlady, Senora Valdez, was a widow herself, short round with sharp eyes and hands that moved like wind over dough. She spoke in Spanish laced with Quechua, and though Eleanor didn't understand most of it, The rhythm felt like music. She handed Eleanor the keys without asking questions, and that was the first gift. Inside, the house smelled of sage and orange peels. A single room, a bed, a tiny stove, and a view from the window that made Eleanor pause each time she passed it. Mountains so close they felt like old gods watching over her. She unpacked slowly. One dress, 2 blouses, a scarf Harold had given her on their 40th anniversary, the leather-bound journal she now filled each night, and the framed black-and-white photo of Marcus as a boy barefoot in a garden, arms stretched wide. She placed that one face down inside a drawer. In the days that followed, Eleanor wandered the village on foot. She learned where the goats slept at noon and which dogs wouldn't bite. She discovered a narrow path that led to a small creek, and a woman who sold tea leaves wrapped in cotton sacks dyed with flowers. It was the tea that caught her attention most. Not the taste, she hadn't even sipped it yet, but the way the woman prepared it. With reverence, with ceremony, as if each movement carried the weight of 1,000 years. Eleanor returned the next morning, palms open, asking nothing, and offering only a glance of curiosity. The woman nodded once slowly. She handed Eleanor a ceramic bowl and pointed to the herbs Muña, Manzanilla, Cedrón. The names rolled off her tongue like lullabies. She showed her how to grind them by hand, how to steep them in silence, how to listen to the water, not just boil it. There were no lessons, no fee, no syllabus. Just days spent side by side, 2 women who had lost more than they could say, finding comfort in steam and ritual. Eleanor's hands adapted quickly. Her motions became instinct. Her silence was welcome. And before long, the neighbors began to notice. They saw her carrying baskets of mint and lemongrass. They saw the smoke curling from the chimney just before dusk. They saw her window open with soft music drifting into the evening. And then they came. The first guest was a German backpacker named Ansel, sunburned, exhausted, with a limp from a bad step on the Inca Trail. He knocked gently, asked in broken Spanish if she sold any tea. Eleanor led him in with a gesture. No words. She brewed him a cup of muña and honey and sat across from him as he winced and sipped. They didn't speak. But when he left an hour later, he touched her shoulder and whispered, "I didn't know I needed this." The second guest was a Peruvian artist from Lima. She had lost her mother to cancer the month before and had been traveling with a sketchbook full of grief. She came in sobbing. Eleanor sat beside her. No advice, no sympathy, just peppermint tea and the weight of shared womanhood. By the end of the week, there were 6 chairs around Eleanor's kitchen table. By the end of the month, there were strangers waiting on the steps at dawn. She didn't call it a business. She never charged a fee. But offerings appeared: fresh bread, handmade beads, a carved flute from a traveling musician, and a name stuck, whispered first by the locals, then the travelers. Father and Son Clouds. A tribute, they said, to the photograph above the doorway, Harold in his army jacket holding a small boy against his chest. Eleanor never corrected them. The tea house grew by accident, organically, like vines that follow the light. She hung herbs to dry from the rafters. She hand-lettered the daily blends on a slate board. She learned enough Spanish to say sit, stay as long as you like. And she learned to let her eyes speak. She had stories, yes, but she shared them in glances. A hand tightened on a teacup when someone mentioned betrayal. A tilt of the head when another woman talked about being invisible. A smile, small sad, when young people said, "I just don't know who I am yet." People came from hostels and monasteries, from cities and nowhere. Some were lost, some were hiding, some were simply tired. They stayed for tea, but they returned for her, and Eleanor, once erased from her own family, became a legend in another. A man from Singapore said the way she steeped cedrón made his insomnia disappear. A woman from Morocco said Eleanor's silence helped her remember her name. An old Chilean farmer came every Sunday just to hold her hand for 5 minutes, then leave without a word. She began keeping a guest book, not for names, but for confessions. Each person wrote a sentence, a truth they'd never spoken aloud. "I miss my daughter every day. I forgave my brother too late. I want to live without apology." Eleanor read each one, then turned the page and waited for the next. Her tea blends changed with the weather, with her mood, with the color of the sky. And somewhere in between the rituals and the whispers, she began to heal. Not dramatically, not completely, but piece by piece. Every morning she opened the shutters to a world that asked nothing of her but presence. Every evening she sat by the window with a cup of her own brew and watched the clouds shift across the mountaintops like slow-moving miracles. She never spoke of Marcus, never mentioned Jade. But when she read a new confession in the guest book, I trusted the wrong person for too long. She smiled softly and poured another cup. Marcus stared at the photo glowing on his laptop screen. The woman was pouring tea into a handmade clay cup. Her hair was pulled back in a loose twist, silver catching the sunlight. Her face, though partially shadowed, carried the unmistakable grace of someone who had survived storms with her spine intact. The blog entry was titled "The Tea Whisperer of the Sacred Valley," written by a Canadian traveler on a soul trek. He zoomed in on the image. The crooked fingers, the tilted brow, the scarf looped softly at her neck. It was Eleanor, his mother, alive, stillness made flesh on the other side of the world. Marcus felt something collapse inside his chest, slow and soundless. Not grief, not shock. Something heavier, shame wrapped in awe. He hadn't heard from her in over 2 months. Her phone disconnected. The apartment sold. Accounts closed. She'd vanished like a shadow slipping through the seams of the day, and now he found her by accident, or fate. He didn't hesitate. He booked the tickets within the hour, one for himself, one for his son, Tommy. Jade had called it impulsive. Dramatic, she said, selfish. That was the last straw. The divorce had already been filed. This trip was not an escape. It was an answer. He and Tommy flew out 3 days later. The international flight was long and quiet. Marcus spent most of it staring out the window, replaying memories he'd tried to forget: his mother's smile, her silent hurt, the envelope, the ticket, the letter that read, "Whatever you do next, earn it." Tommy, 9 years old and sleepy, leaned against his father halfway through the flight and mumbled, "Are we really going to find Grandma?" "Yes," Marcus whispered, "we are." By the time they landed in Cusco, the air felt thinner. Marcus wasn't sure if it was altitude or anticipation. They took a small van to the sacred valley, winding through hairpin turns and fog-wrapped cliffs. Llamas wandered near the road like they owned it. Tommy gasped at every turn. Marcus said little. He was carrying a different kind of weight. When they arrived in the village, the air smelled of earth and eucalyptus. Women with braided hair sold fruit in woven baskets. A group of children kicked a handmade ball in the square. It didn't take long to find the path. Locals knew the place. They called it Las Nubes del Corazón, clouds of the heart. A stone stairway curved up the hillside, bordered by wildflowers that looked like they'd bloomed just for the occasion. Marcus climbed slowly, Tommy gripping his hand, the boy's breath short in the high air. Halfway up, he stopped and looked toward the tea house perched at the top. White walls, blue shutters, smoke curling gently from the chimney. And there by the doorway stood a woman with her back turned, ladling hot water into a row of ceramic cups. She didn't hear him approach at first, didn't see Tommy's small figure standing breathless at the last step. But then she turned. Their eyes met. The world seemed to pause. The bowl in Eleanor's hand slipped slightly, sloshing water onto the clay tray. She set it down without wiping it. Her lips parted, but no words came. She stepped out of the doorway slowly, like a dream approaching reality, cautious not to shatter the moment. Marcus didn't say anything either. There was nothing to explain that hadn't already been lived. He walked toward her, and Eleanor walked toward him. When they met in the center of the stone path under the amber breath of sunset, they didn't speak. They just embraced. Marcus buried his face into the curve of her neck the way he hadn't done since he was a child. Her arms wrapped around him with a strength that startled him, that reminded him she had never been fragile, only patient. Eleanor trembled slightly, but the tears that rose in her eyes never fell. She had cried all she needed to. Now she simply held her son and forgave him in silence. A second later, a blur of movement dashed between them, small arms wrapping around Eleanor's waist. Grandma Tommy shouted, muffled against her skirt, "I missed you." Eleanor looked down, and something inside her finally broke open. She dropped to her knees. "Oh, my sweet boy." She hugged him with both arms, pressing her forehead to his. Tommy giggled. "Dad said we'd find you, but I didn't know it'd be in the clouds." Eleanor laughed softly. It was the first real sound of joy that had passed her lips in a long time. She glanced up at Marcus. "Does he know?" "Everything," she asked quietly. Not the dark stuff Marcus said, just that you were somewhere beautiful. She nodded. That's enough for now. Tommy took her hand. Can I see your tea? Dad says you're famous. Eleanor smiled. Come, she said. I'll show you how to make clouds in a cup. Inside the tea house was filled with light. Guests had left for the day, but the scent of mint and citrus still lingered. A wooden guest book sat open on the table with a message from someone who had written, "This place made me remember who I was before the world told me who I had to be." Marcus sat on a bench by the window watching his mother move, gracefully, intentionally, with quiet power. Tommy perched on a stool, eyes wide, as Eleanor folded herbs into cheesecloth, poured water, timed her movements with care. Is it magic? He asked. No, she said. It's memory and patience. She poured a cup for him, then one for Marcus, and one for herself. The three of them sat in a row, sipped, and said nothing. Outside, the sun dropped behind the peaks, turning the sky violet and gold. Eventually, Marcus broke the silence. Jade's gone. Eleanor looked at him but didn't speak. She said I changed, he added. She was right. He looked around the tea house. You built something, he said. I rebuilt, Eleanor corrected. Marcus lowered his gaze. I'm sorry it took me so long to see clearly. She reached over, touched his hand. You saw it when you were ready. That's all we can ask for. He nodded. The evening stretched around them like soft cloth. Later, after Tommy had fallen asleep, curled up on a woven blanket beside the stove, Marcus walked back outside with Eleanor. They stood beneath a sky so vast it could hold every mistake they had ever made and still make room for hope. Will you come back? Eleanor asked softly. I don't know yet, Marcus admitted. Everything's so different now. Different can be good, she said. It's how we grow. He looked at her, saw the lines on her face, the light in her eyes. I don't want to lose you again. She squeezed his arm. Then don't. They stood together in the silence. No past, no future. Just mother and son beneath a sky full of stars. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like enough. Morning came differently in the Sacred Valley. It didn't burst through the windows. It settled in gently like a familiar hand on your shoulder. The air was cool, filled with the scent of dew and wild herbs, and the mountains stood still and quiet, as if watching over those below. For Eleanor, mornings had always meant silence. A moment to breathe before the world needed anything from her. But now the world had changed. Now there was laughter in the kitchen. Now there were footsteps that didn't belong to ghosts. Grandma, do I stir it clockwise or counterclockwise? Tommy's voice floated from the tea table where he stood on a stool far too big for him, both hands carefully wrapped around a clay bowl. Clockwise for calm, Eleanor answered gently, sorting herbs from a woven basket. Counterclockwise for courage. Tommy paused. What if I want both? Then stir both ways, she said, smiling. But end with calm. Always end with calm. Marcus chuckled from the corner where he was hammering a loose window latch. He's taking this more seriously than baseball. Eleanor turned and looked at her son. He had a smudge of dust on his cheek sleeves rolled up, and that expression of quiet focus she hadn't seen in years. Not since he was a boy building cardboard cities in their living room. You were always a fixer, she said. He looked up, surprised by the warmth in her tone. Maybe I just needed the right place to fix. They stayed longer than planned. Originally, Marcus had told his office he'd be gone for a week, maybe 10 days. But the days here didn't move in corporate increments. They unfolded like petals, slow, purposeful, scented with things you couldn't name. And Eleanor didn't ask him to stay. She simply made space. Each morning, the tea house opened with no sign, no marketing. And yet the foot traffic increased. Word had spread a new energy, a return of the woman with silver hair and eyes like old stone, but now joined by a young man who poured tea with steady hands, and a boy who made everyone smile without trying. Visitors came for the drinks. They stayed for the stories. Marcus, once a man of spreadsheets and silence, now shared cups of cedron and listened as travelers confessed their fears, their regrets, their quiet triumphs. A woman from Berlin cried into her third cup, whispering that she'd finally forgiven her father. A widower from Ecuador wrote in the guest book, I thought I'd never laugh again. But this boy just told me a joke about a llama wearing a sombrero, and I laughed. Tommy soaked it all in. He learned to balance cups without spilling. He memorized the names of each herb and what they meant. But more than that, he watched how his father had changed, how his grandmother had softened. and how the space between them, once filled with silence and blame, had grown warm and lived in. One evening, after the last guest had left and the lamps were dimmed, Eleanor sat with Marcus on the bench outside the tea house. The sky bled orange and lavender over the peaks. Wind tugged gently at their sleeves. From inside, the faint sound of Tommy's humming drifted out as he cleaned the bowls. "He loves it here," Marcus said. "He feels safe," Eleanor replied. Marcus nodded, looking out into the distance. "I used to think safety came from knowing what's next, from structure, control. But I've never seen my son more at peace than he is right now, with herbs and steam and wild dogs barking in the distance." "He's learning how to listen," Eleanor said softly. "Most people grow up learning how to speak, but very few learn how to truly listen." There was a long pause. Then Marcus asked, "Why here? Why tea? Why this place?" Eleanor breathed in the night air before answering. "Because it's simple," she said, "and because it asks nothing of me except presence. Because every cup I pour is an apology I'll never get, a story I don't need to retell. And because the people who come here don't want to fix me, they just want to sit beside me." Marcus didn't respond right away. Then he turned and looked at her, really looked. "Did you think I wouldn't come?" She looked back at him steady. "I thought if you came, it would be because you wanted to, not because you were guilted, or trapped, or embarrassed." She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small brass key tied to a thin ribbon. She held it out to him. "The tea house?" he asked. She nodded. "If one day I go farther than this, if I don't wake up to light the stove, or if my hands forget the weight of clay, I want you to have it." He hesitated. "I don't know how to run a place like this." "You don't have to," she said. "Just keep the kettle warm and listen with your whole heart. The rest takes care of itself." He took the key, held it in both hands like it might vanish. Inside, Tommy called out, "Grandma, I folded the towels like you taught me." Eleanor smiled. "You're hired, darling." Marcus stood, placing the key in his shirt pocket. They walked inside together. That night, the three of them sat on the rooftop terrace, sharing a pot of thé de montagne under a blanket of stars. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't talk about Jade. They didn't talk about broken trusts or betrayal. They talked about dreams. Tommy said he wanted to build a tea cart and travel to other villages. Marcus said he might start writing again, something about fathers and sons and steam rising into silence. And Eleanor, she said nothing. She just watched them, her eyes reflecting starlight. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a ghost inside her own life. She felt whole, at peace, connected, not by blood, but by choice, by the tea leaves, by the healing, by the decision to stay even after everything had shattered. Because sometimes the most sacred family isn't the one you're born into. It's the one you come home to when the journey has changed you enough to finally see it. The photograph sat beneath a pane of glass framed in driftwood and sunlight. Eleanor in profile pouring tea into a simple ceramic cup, her eyes half closed, her mouth curled ever so slightly at the corner, neither smiling nor solemn, just present, just there. It hung above the table where she used to sit each morning facing the sunrise. Now that table held a single small candle and a brass bowl of dried lavender, refreshed every Thursday by a boy who looked more like her with each passing month. A year had passed, 12 moons since the last cup she ever poured, 11 since Marcus had found her still in her sleep, her hands folded over her chest, the faint scent of mint still on her skin. A quiet ending, no pain, no spectacle. She'd simply slipped into the clouds she'd spent a lifetime brewing. She left no instructions, no demands, only a note in her journal. "If I am gone, let them keep the door open, that's all I ask." And they had. The tea house, once a quiet sanctuary for wandering souls, was now something else entirely, a heartbeat. Locals called it Casa de las Nubes. Travelers still whispered the old name Clouds of Father and Son, but now it bore a subtitle on the handmade sign hung over the entrance. In memory of Eleanor. She left quietly but never truly left. Marcus ran it now, not alone, with help, and with purpose. The space had grown, not in size but in spirit. People brought books, instruments, stories. Children painted tiles in the back garden. Mothers came to sit without being touched, without being needed. Veterans shared stories they'd buried for years. There were no prices, only donations, only kindness, only tea, Marcus wore linen shirts now, and a pendant Eleanor once wore on market days. He spoke less, listened more. And he'd finally published his book. It had started as letters to her. It became something else entirely. My Mother's Final Journey was the English title. In Spanish, El viaje silencioso de mamá. But it was known most widely by the name Tommy had given it, written in crooked marker on the first printed copy. The Last Trip of Grandma Eleanor. It swept through reading groups like wildfire. People cried on subways, left copies in hospital waiting rooms, wrote in the margins. One reviewer called it a son's apology written in steam and silence. Another a map for anyone who's ever lost someone before they could say sorry. It became a bestseller in 6 countries. But Marcus never spoke of the numbers. He only ever said, "She told me to earn it. This is my start." As for Jade, her unraveling came with less poetry. When Marcus returned from Peru that first time and requested a full forensic audit of their joint accounts, she fought back hard, accused him of betrayal, of manipulation. She sent lawyers, sent emails dripping with polished rage. But numbers don't lie. The investigation revealed years of discreet embezzlement, not just from Marcus, from past clients, from family accounts, even from her own nonprofit board. The headlines were brutal. Local designer faces, fraud charges, after husband blows whistle, when the perfect wife is a perfect thief. Jade was indicted on multiple counts of financial misconduct. Her face vanished from fundraisers and gala invitations. She cried during her arraignment. Marcus never showed up in court. He didn't need to. Truth, he had learned, didn't always need to raise its voice. Meanwhile, back at the tea house, life moved gently. Tommy had taken to giving tours, not formal ones, just stories. He'd walk new guests to the photo wall stop in front of Eleanor's portrait and say, "That's my grandma. She used to live here. She wasn't very tall, but she was really strong. She taught my dad how to be good." Then he'd tilt his head thoughtfully as if remembering a recipe and add, "She also taught me how to stir tea for courage." The visitors would smile, sometimes cry, sometimes stay, and always they came back. One late afternoon, as the valley filled with gold and shadow, Marcus and Tommy sat on the bench outside the house, the one Eleanor used to call her sunset seat. Tommy had his sketchbook in his lap. He was drawing the mountains, trying to capture the curve of cloud around the summit. "Do you miss her?" he asked suddenly. Marcus nodded, eyes on the horizon. "Every day." Tommy didn't speak for a moment, then softly, "Sometimes I think she's in the steam." Marcus turned. "In the tea?" Tommy nodded. "Yeah, like when I'm quiet and I hold the cup right under my nose, it feels like she's talking." Marcus smiled. "She probably is." Tommy looked up. "What do you think she'd say now?" Marcus leaned back, closing his eyes as the sun touched the ridge. "I think she'd say we're doing just fine." That night they lit candles around the table and hosted a reading circle. The villagers brought sweet bread. Travelers brought poetry. Marcus read aloud from the final chapter of his book. In it, he described the last morning he saw his mother alive, the way she looked out the window before the guests arrived, the way she stirred her tea, the words she wrote before bed. Sometimes leaving isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the final act of loving yourself. He read the line again. The room stilled. A woman in the back wept openly. Tommy sat beside him, his hand resting on his father's arm, a small teacup between them. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. The mountains exhaled, and the stars began to appear. Later, when the guests had gone, Marcus stood alone at the door. He looked out across the valley and whispered, "You were right, Mom." Then he reached for the light switch. But just before the lamps dimmed, the screen began to fade, not with silence, but with a voice. Eleanor's voice, warm, worn, whole, carried over images of her pouring tea, brushing her hand over Tommy's hair, sitting beneath a cloud-drenched sky. Her voice said, "Sometimes leaving isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the final act of loving yourself." The camera pulled back slowly. From the tea table, to the porch, to the house, to the winding path, to the village, to the mountain, to the clouds, and then fade to white. And they had. The tea house, once a quiet sanctuary for wandering souls, was now something else entirely. A heartbeat. Locals called it Casa de las Nubes. Travelers still whispered the old name, Clouds of Father and Son, but now it bore a subtitle on the handmade sign hung over the entrance, in memory of Eleanor. She left quietly but never truly left. Marcus ran it now, not alone, with help, and with purpose. The space had grown, not in size but in spirit. People brought books, instruments, stories. Children painted tiles in the back garden. Mothers came to sit without being touched, without being needed. Veterans shared stories they'd buried for years. There were no prices, only donations, only kindness, only tea. Marcus wore linen shirts now, and a pendant Eleanor once wore on market days. He spoke less, listened more. And he'd finally published his book. It had started as letters to her. It became something else entirely. My mother's final journey was the English title. In Spanish, El viaje silencioso de mamá. But it was known most widely by the name Tommy had given it, written in crooked marker on the first printed copy. The Last Trip of Grandma Eleanor. It swept through reading groups like wildfire. People cried on subways, left copies in hospital waiting rooms, wrote in the margins. One reviewer called it a son's apology written in steam and silence. Another a map for anyone who's ever lost someone before they could say sorry. It became a bestseller in 6 countries, but Marcus never spoke of the numbers. He only ever said, "She told me to earn it. This is my start." As for Jade, her unraveling came with less poetry. When Marcus returned from Peru that first time and requested a full forensic audit of their joint accounts, she fought back hard, accused him of betrayal, of manipulation. She sent lawyers, sent emails dripping with polished rage. But numbers don't lie. The investigation revealed years of discreet embezzlement, not just from Marcus, from past clients, from family accounts, even from her own nonprofit board. The headlines were brutal. Local designer faces. Fraud charges after husband blows whistle. When the perfect wife is a perfect thief. Jade was indicted on multiple counts of financial misconduct. Her face vanished from fundraisers and gala invitations. She cried during her arraignment. Marcus never showed up in court. He didn't need to. Truth he had learned didn't always need to raise its voice. Meanwhile, back at the tea house, life moved gently. Tommy had taken to giving tours, not formal ones, just stories. He'd walk new guests to the photo wall, stop in front of Eleanor's portrait and say, "That's my grandma. She used to live here. She wasn't very tall, but she was really strong. She taught my dad how to be good." Then he'd tilt his head thoughtfully as if remembering a recipe and add, "She also taught me how to stir tea for courage." The visitors would smile, sometimes cry, sometimes stay, and always they came back. One late afternoon, as the valley filled with gold and shadow, Marcus and Tommy sat on the bench outside the house, the one Eleanor used to call her sunset seat. Tommy had his sketchbook in his lap. He was drawing the mountains, trying to capture the curve of cloud around the summit. "Do you miss her?" he asked suddenly. Marcus nodded, eyes on the horizon. "Every day." Tommy didn't speak for a moment. Then softly, "Sometimes I think she's in the steam." Marcus turned. "In the tea." Tommy nodded. "Yeah. Like, when I'm quiet and I hold the cup right under my nose, it feels like she's talking." Marcus smiled. "She probably is." Tommy looked up. "What do you think she'd say now?" Marcus leaned back, closing his eyes as the sun touched the ridge. "I think she'd say we're doing just fine." That night they lit candles around the table and hosted a reading circle. The villagers brought sweet bread. Travelers brought poetry. Marcus read aloud from the final chapter of his book. In it, he described the last morning he saw his mother alive, the way she looked out the window before the guests arrived, the way she stirred her tea, the words she wrote before bed. Sometimes leaving isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the final act of loving yourself. He read the line again. The room stilled. A woman in the back wept openly. Tommy sat beside him, his hand resting on his father's arm, a small teacup between them. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. The mountains exhaled, and the stars began to appear. Later, when the guests had gone, Marcus stood alone at the door. He looked out across the valley and whispered, "You were right, Mom." Then he reached for the light switch. But just before the lamps dimmed, the screen began to fade, not with silence, but with a voice. Eleanor's voice, warm, worn, whole, carried over images of her pouring tea, brushing her hand over Tommy's hair, sitting beneath a cloud-drenched sky. Her voice said, "Sometimes leaving isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the final act of loving yourself." The camera pulled back slowly. From the tea table, to the porch, to the house, to the winding path, to the village, to the mountain, to the clouds, and then fade to white.